Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our weekly Q&A. I'm TJ from Passend Education on a mission to make gifted... Oh, oh, all right. Well, you're going to have to edit this now, Fatiha, because that took a while. Okay, so welcome to our weekly Q&A. I'm TJ from Passend Education on a mission to make gifted kids more happy, autonomous, and successful. And we had a few interesting questions this week about differentiation and particularly how we can help our kids in our classrooms or particularly helping the teachers understand what it needs to basically keep our kids engaged. And I think it might be good to talk a bit about what, of course, the challenges are that we tend to see, and then looking at like what kind of differentiation techniques we could run into in classes. And then finally, I want to talk a bit about how we as parents can advocate for um, differentiation in the classroom, and particularly in a way that we hope to not cause too much mayhem and frustration and anger and resentment on both sides of the aisle. Particularly, because oftentimes these battlegrounds between parents and teachers don't necessarily always take into consideration that these poor kids that we need to help get affected by them too. So let's dive a little bit into when a gifted kid needs more challenge in their classroom. And when you look at like what parents look for in their classrooms and what the teachers look for in the classrooms, a lot of the things that we see as friction seems to be quite the same, although the way that both teachers and parents look at them is still slightly different, right? So I did a bit of research at the moment, like what are the most common challenges that parents ask questions about online. And these are the ones that parents run into. The very common one is school is boring, right? So that is definitely a big thing. Whenever we do assessments, we see a lot of kids say this school is boring. And they don't really necessarily know exactly how to describe what that means, because boring is not always easy to explain, but it's a very common complaint we get. Right. We tend to see that parents say, yeah, finishing too quickly. My kids are always ahead. I always have to wait for everybody else. Obviously, they're very much related to being bored, although that's not always the case. Sometimes the rewards that you get from being the first one to finish are enticing enough to not feel the boredom for some of the kids. On the other side of that is like rushing work. So that is like trying to get rid of it, kind of get through it as quick as possible so that they don't have to deal with it. Or the exact opposite, which is perfectionism. Right. So perfectionism in itself is not necessarily something we only see in gifted kids, but it's really it manifests earlier. I've had 4-year-olds that were perfectionistic, which is very, very rare. Loss of motivation. This is obviously a little bit more obvious during the time like key stage 2 or 3 when kids start to like get a little bit more reluctance towards school. But really, really obvious in key stage 4 when exams are happening and challenges are going up. Now, the emotional outbursts, we know that this is related to the emotional overexcitabilities that kids have. So that's very common phrases are, my kids are like, they seem to be in this distraught for things that they shouldn't be, or they stay in their anger a lot longer, or they switch on a dime. And we know that this has to do with the emotional hypersensitivity that a lot of gifted individuals experience. And then at home, they see a lot of avoidance. And that avoidance is around tasks, like procrastination is obviously a way that we can see avoidance. Sometimes it's by hyper focusing on things that they feel they're very good at. So there's lots of different ways that avoidance at home can manifest itself. It could also be avoidance of social settings, so not wanting to go to parties or not wanting to engage even at the dinner table with things, and that is the kind of avoidance that they notice. And a very common phrase is, of course, like I already know this. I've heard this is something I already know. Not always from a negative perspective. Like sometimes the whole idea of like I already know this comes from like I want to show that I know. Right, so they'll only regurgitate things that they already know that are 100% correct, and they want to show this. Right, so it sometimes is hides as a positive thing. Now, school is boring often comes with different kinds of behaviors that teachers are struggling with. So when they're bored, understimulated, which means that the amount of dopamine they get for the task that is currently at hand is not enough for the brain to say, okay, let's keep doing this. That manifests in a few different ways. Like very common, like calling it out is one, but also like interrupting the class. So this is where a lot of our gifted kids get told that they look a bit like ADHD. Sometimes they find other ways to keep themselves busy. It's very fun to poke a friend of yours and see what kind of mayhem that creates. But sometimes it's just about talking about things that they are interested in, right? So distracting can take many forms. Inconsistent effort, what we tend to see with gifted kids is when they're under challenge, they want something more. And often when something is new and novel, they really like it. I've had kids as young as 4 years old, like observing them in preschool, where you could see them trying something new in the first 2 minutes, 3 minutes of a class, and then they would immediately like switch off. And in kindergarten class, elements are very, very quick, like a few minutes at best. So they should really normally hold attention. But this particular boy, you could just see like 5 seconds. Well, I know this already, and then we just move on. Like these kids were working on phonetics, and this boy could read the names of all the planets and so on. So you can imagine, like how hard that is to keep an effort going if you already can read multi-syllable words, and then some other kids are just working on their phonetics. Right, so the inconsistent effort is something that they see, that sometimes again like looks a bit like the rushing work or the perfectionism part. But there we go. Now the work avoidance is again quite varied with teachers. They sometimes it's about like just saying I don't want to do this, or just writing other silly things on stuff, or they start walking around. But when we look at like when teachers get think this is a problem is when the work has to be done and when it has to be handed in. And in later stages of their life, this could literally be like, oh, I've like excuses that allow them to avoid doing the work, including sometimes like calling in sick and saying like, oh, I can't do this. I literally got a message today from one of the kids that missed a few lessons for one reason, and the mom was asking like, "Hey, he's already sort of being reluctant to come to class because he's worried that like he needs to do some extra work, or that he might not be able to show what he can do. So that's we don't even have class the upcoming week, for example. So this can be quite intense. Um, Questioning instructions. This is what we see a lot with what we call challenging creative types. It's like, why are we doing this? What's the point? That this overarching need for more understanding that gifted kids tend to have. You're finishing too fast, right? Whenever we run classes as teachers, ideally we want to be in a situation where like at exactly the last moment we're done exactly at the same time. Everybody has a nice revelation. The amount of work and effort that we put in was all great. And you do have those particular situations happen on occasion, but they're definitely not a very common occurrence. So yeah, like finishing too. If you have kids that always are the first one to finish and then start to like wander around and sit on beanbags somewhere and then distracting the class as a result, is always a bit of a tricky one. Emotional sensitivity, like getting kids to see them cry about things that they want, is very similar, of course, to the emotional outbursts that you see at home. But like we tend to see, particularly in Asia, there's a lot of gifted kids are masking more, and they're a little bit less likely to act out. Not that it doesn't happen at all, but of course, but we tend to see with girls particularly is that the emotional sensitivity is there. They just seem to be pulling it inwards. And then the big one is uneven performance. Um, when I tell teachers, like when you see the final grade at the end of a term, you tend to see like, okay, well that's like a B or it's an A or whatever the grade they get. But when teachers do CAs and so on, there's obviously that little bit of up and down. And generally speaking, like most kids will have a similar trajectory, but a lot of gifted kids tend to have like a high A and then a very low D, and so they end up sometimes with like an average B, and it seems fine. But that uneven performance is basically an indication of fast mastery and then fast moving on, which gifted kids struggle with. So these are the problems that we run into class, and um, the way that we treat these is not necessarily as behaviors that are wrong, but signals that there's something wrong with the curriculum that is supposed to be helping our kids. And the best theory I like to use for this always is like theory of flow. For those that haven't heard of this one, flow, of course, is a theory by the forever impronounceable name. I just call him Mikael because like that's his first name and I can pronounce that one. But it's a C with hundreds of letters that shouldn't be have any business being in the right kind of order that they should be. But flow is the idea that if you have effort and rewards, so rewards being here and effort being here, is that we have a bit of a line that we want to achieve. And ideally, you want to have the exact amount of effort to match the amount of reward that you get. And that if we would be in that particular situation, we would be super happy because that's one way we can make sure that we normally get the most out of our energy. Right. And realistically, this is not really a line. This is more like a band. Like if we can be in this band, we are fine. And what happens when we work ourselves into flow? We feel really nice. If something is too hard, so if the effort basically like is not matching the reward, so the effort we have to put in gives a too low kind of reward here, then we're bored. So anything below here means we're bored. We're putting in a lot of effort, but we're just not getting any reward out of this. And the flip side of that is anxious, right? So anything up here means that we're not really feeling like sure that the that we can actually get the reward that we need, right? So and basically there is a little line here which I called hyperfocus. So hyperfocus is when we're kind of panicky and we have to get stuff done. It looks very similar to flow. Like flow, when you're in a flow state, you really feel good about yourself. You really want to achieve. Like people call this like almost like a state of trance. In the works about flow, they talk a lot about people that climb mountains and how like once you get into the flow of mountain climbing, it's sort of like the whole mountain kind of disappears and you can only think about the next hold and things that you can do. And you can do this with a lot of stuff. I used to play very high level judo, and whenever I would go into a match, it's like almost like the entire world slowed down and sped up at the same time. It's a really fun and interesting experience. And you can achieve this with hard work and things like that too. So what we tend to see nowadays with a lot of people working in office settings is that when they get into flow, they go, wow, okay, like 2 hours has passed and I've got a ton of stuff done and it feels really good. And in a lot of ways, a lot of stuff that we do with our kids in school is to try and keep kids in that flow state as best we can. So effectively, as things sort of become easier and easier to do, we sort of become, because we practice them more, we get a little bit, we start like adding like okay, like we start here, and if something starts there, it's too hard. We don't want to engage, so we have to explain things, and then people sort of like get it, they practice it, and if they keep doing the same thing, they flow into boredom, which is also not okay. So we introduce a new thing. And then as teachers, our job is to sort of keep them sort of wiggling back and forth in between this line. And if we do that right, then the kids are enjoying themselves. What tends to happen is like when we look at almost all the reasons why gifted kids struggle is either it's related to their emotional well-being, and we've done a lot of work in our previous videos on like how to help them with their happiness. But if the happiness is in order and we're starting to see these particular characteristics, normally we know that we're having a flow issue, right? So that's where we have to sit down with the kids and go, okay, what can we do? So what do we do in classes? What are the most common ways of differentiation? And there is like 12 that from Passend Education like listed down as like very important. And what I've done here is I've put them basically not really in a crazy order, because I don't necessarily think there's like one you should do first or last, but we do have a few that like are core strategies that are used the most. And I would say that like if you look at international schooling, the ones in the middle of this web are sort of grouped together. Um, and yeah, like it's basically a simple representation saying, well, everything that is orange here is very often used. The supporting strategies are normally there to help out with it. But the most common ones that everybody probably knows in our settings in Malaysia and international schools and private schools are the ones here in the middle, right? So, but look at them as a big spider web. You can go back and forth between all of them. They support each other, and they're basically not a replacement of each other. So it's also not like the case if a school only does one of these things, um, then like they can't do the others. When I started my work in Malaysia, one of the first things I did is I did a survey among the 185 international schools specifically about what levels of differentiation they all use. And it was pretty dire at that time. We had maybe like two schools that would consider acceleration, and I call acceleration a little bit of the easy, lazy version of differentiation. I'll go into that a little bit more detail. But basically, let me go through these one at a time, and then I'll tell you like how I think a school should be using these, and then how you as a parent can use um, some questions or consider it or encouragement with schools to tell them, okay, this is what I think you should focus on. So um, in the West, pre-testing is a really, really strong core strategy. The idea with pre-testing is that like you don't look at like what the kids already know. So a normal test tends to happen at the end of a curriculum block. It basically tests if the stuff that we taught them sticks and whether they can bring it back. But pre-testing actually allows you to test kids before they even learn the topic. So the whole class is supposed to be doing a test, and it isn't always like a traditional test. This could also be a little project where you can test and see what level of skill is there, like whatever it is. And then you look at the class and you go, okay, what are the gaps? What are we missing? And then you adjust the curriculum or the pace of the curriculum to the needs of the kids, right? So before you start teaching, you find out what they know. And I find it very interesting. Like in Malaysia, very few schools do this. It's in the Netherlands, it's really, really common. Like particularly in primary school, but even in high school, we have elements of pre-testing that is really important for the teachers to change what they need to teach. So that's the first one, pre-testing. And technically, most curriculum materials will have some form of a test that they can do. So it's actually quite an easy one to implement. The only thing you need to do is like do 20 minutes before the first lesson that you give, you do a pre-test. Most of the curriculum materials in international schools will have some kind of bridge into the subject matter, like something cool to do to get people excited. There's lots of ways that you can do this. You can even go to a museum, for example, if you have a little bit more time and resources. But like little tests or little scientific experiments at the start of like a new block is often a way to get kids excited about doing things. So like you could use those things as pre-test, and so it should actually mean that their first lesson could be very easily just a little introduction into the whole thing, but with a pre-test in front, so that the next week when you see them, you can decide, okay, what can we do? So when you go from pre-testing, normally the next step to do then is to compact. This is again a relatively low effort way of differentiating. So compacting looks at like the test that you've done, the work that is coming, and then just taking out all the nonsense that you don't need. So like, okay, the kids already know this, then let's not bring it up again. I will focus on the gaps that they have, right? So compacting particularly looks at removing repetitive tasks and practice, and only, of course, after mastery is shown. So one of the ways that I tell my A-level students is like, make question one, right? Skip everything onto like the last question, this question, the last one. And if both of these are correct, you move on. If one of them is wrong, you just make the question before it, like question L minus one, if we're trying to be a little bit, and then you keep doing that until you show that your mastery is there. and that is one way that you can actually compact stuff quite a bit. There's a lot of busy work in curriculum materials because a lot of it is still based on rote learning principles. So when you compact and move on, things get a little bit more interesting. What is interesting though is that like tiered assignments is like if you could compacting still takes the existing curriculum and applies it essentially to everybody and only moves some stuff away. In a very similar vein, like a little bit more uncommon way is tiered assignments. So you really go, okay, everybody in the class gets something different to do. This is hard for a lot of schools to implement, but it's technically the best way to do this, where you can say, okay, well, you know this, here's something that either makes you practice this more, whether it needs, and that's a thing that we do a lot in our peer classes, where we say, okay, like all our kids are working on completely different things. And there's some stuff that you can do in the other differentiation materials that make it easier. But like, yeah, so the best way to look at tiered assignments is just a more deeper version of compacting, essentially. Okay. Now, from pre-testing, the other way, you can actually also start flexible grouping. But what a lot of teachers do is they just say, okay, my class sits and we sit them all in neat rows and the teacher is on this end. That's very common. It's a very old-fashioned way of looking at stuff. Like, I definitely think that this is definitely not the right kind of way. This is, when you look at the online complaints about like schools being factories, this is one of them. So what we tend to see a little bit more frequent now is like little groups of tables. And then one thing that's kind of interesting is what I see a lot of teachers do is then they say, okay, I want everybody to learn how to work together with everybody because that's an important skill. And then what they do is they assign people to groups based on randomization. So you say, okay, like we just draw some straws or whatever, and then everybody sits there. And then normally what happens, we'll have some fights or whatever, and then people get moved around a little bit. But and that's definitely better than the first situation, but it is not ideal still. What ideally you want to do if you talk about flexible grouping is you say, okay, well, depending on what topic I'm teaching, some kids will have more mastery than others. So what you do is you use the data from your pretest and you say, okay, like we're going to switch these groups around based on level of ability and understanding in that particular topic. And that means that this almost becomes like a little chair dance kind of thing where kids, every topic move around a little bit. Obviously, in secondary, you'd have that a little bit less because you tend to only teach a single topic. Although science is still a good example of this because, particularly in key stage 3, science is still this like combined thing. Humanities is also like a bit of a weird Frankenstein of geography and history in a lot of ways. So in those particular things, you could still have grouping because some kids are interested in history or they're not so much in geography and vice versa, right? So you can move stuff around. And what we tend to do in the Netherlands is we actually have like a little amphitheater type of desk with a teacher sitting there. And then what the teacher does is brings groups to that little amphitheater and then instructs to the different groups, not as a whole class, but always to small groups. The idea is that these kids will have something to do in the meantime. And then what happens is you can have your fast students start and you give them very little instruction because they tend to know things. They can also figure things out. So you even limit the amount of questions they can ask and you get them started very quickly. Then you move on to the second strongest group. You give them a little bit more of a explanation, and then you get them to start on the work as well. And then you have a lot more time for the students that are a little bit weaker in that particular subject. And basically, these two stronger groups, or the ones wherever you put them, will basically take care of themselves. And they can even, because they're one of the things that a lot of kids get asked to do is like, oh, can you help your friend out with things? And explaining somebody how to do something when you're roughly at the same understanding level works really well. It's a great way to test if you have mastery in the subject. But if one understands the topic immensely well and another doesn't, what we tend to see is that actually the teaching becomes super, super hard because all of a sudden we're asking the student to also work on their teaching skills, which teaching as a profession is not easy. think you've any of you have probably run into that before. There's lots of techniques. There's lots of things you need to do about listening. When do you give an answer? When you don't give an answer? Like when you let people find stuff out yourself. That push and pull is very important. So it's a little bit unfair to actually ask other students to just like, okay, can you do that as well? Like, and but particularly with gifted kids, we can see that they absolutely hate that part, particularly if it's done as a way to keep them busy. Right. So flexible grouping is a really interesting way. And as what you might have seen is that up until now, we still haven't really changed much in what the actual stuff is available within a class. So any teacher with a normal classroom should be able to conduct all these three things easily. Now, the tiered assignments requires extra stuff, which is why it's not done as often, of course. But the other three, any teacher should be able to do in their classroom normally. When we get to the next one, this goes up a little bit more, like stretching or accordioning, like the musical instruments, where depending on the strength of the students, we have to sometimes stretch the actual materials as far as we can. And that normally means like taking materials from a year above, right? Like, so you could say, this child can do year three, they're in year three, and they can do year five level math. Then we get work from year five, and we let them do that during the normal classroom. This is particularly important if the kid isn't really good across the board. And it's sort of like a halfway version of acceleration, like skipping a grade in that sense. Right. So um, after those two things, like enrichment and project-based learning, they're in a similar vein. A lot of people think they're the same, but it's not. Like enrichment is really about making sure that the thing that you do is it has like a meaning in the rest of the world. So you can, and that means like either physically or philosophically, like that doesn't really matter. But the idea is that you're trying to create real life situations and that help with understanding, but still within a confined space. So that's why, for example, learning how to do programming with robots, you could teach people like programming just from a screen and on a computer, but bringing a robot that actually moves around makes it more an enriching experiment. So that is where we sit. Project-based learning is similar. Often you have a project, but the projects tend to be more about like start to finish, like come up with a particular idea and then like make a smart goal, work that out, like all the things you need to do to get a project finished. And the kids have a lot of responsibility on the steps and their own time management. Whereas enrichment classes can still just be very traditional, like we're going to learn lesson one, lesson two, lesson three, even if they're doing it by themselves. So a good example is Arduino materials. They often have like 20 lesson plan steps, and there is a lot of stuff involved with them, but it's still like lesson plans you have to follow in a particular way. Right, so that is the difference between project-based learning and enrichment. The thing with all of that, like, and this is really important for gifted kids. Like, this is why this is a little bit here. I can't really find it in like how we get there from all the other stuff. Is you can have subjects or questions that don't really have a single fixed answer that can keep going, and they're kind of like difficult to understand sometimes, but like you could say, okay, well, you know what, like program a game and make a few levels and then make as many levels as you can. There's technically no end to that until the lesson is done. Open-ended tasks are really good to keep fast students engaged, and they definitely work. They have a little bit of a danger that they could run out of steam, and particularly if the kids don't have the metacognition skills to sit still, focus on them, and so on, or if they're a little bit afraid to fail and the thing becomes a little bit hard, because most of these open-ended tasks, they don't have really an end to them either, they can paint themselves a bit in a corner. And the idea is that they work on this by themselves and that the teachers are not really involved with helping them, essentially. Um, the last three, which is the independent inquiry, the learning contracts, and then the choice board and differentiation closet, are quite novel in schools that we work with. In help, I've done quite a lot of training on differentiation closets specifically. The idea of a differentiation closet is that it's closets of either a digital physical space with extra learning materials that the kids can pick and choose from as they want. And if you're really good at making or curating a differentiation closet, it is related to the actual task. It's even better if the students themselves can be involved with what is in those closets by doing votes, by asking the kids what they want in there. And they're normally like more like a class management tool to really help the kids keep busy. So when I was talking about that example about like, okay, moving around, what you can do is you can have a differentiation closet somewhere in there, and you tell the kids, okay, we're going to do math today. I want you guys to take anything out of the differentiation closet to keep yourself busy with math. And then I'm going to call you guys up and I'm going to give you this week's work, for example. That's one way that differentiation closet could be used. But it could also be used if somebody is done and finished, you say, okay, like take something from there. And we normally advocate for 3 levels. So like the first one being just giving a little bit more agency in the actual curriculum already exists. So this is one way of taking the homework and saying we chop it up into small bits and the kids can choose which ones they can work with first. Then we have a little bit more of extension style kind of work that is more interesting, ideally more enriching. And then finally, we have the inquiry-based stuff in there. So the inquiry-based things can be part of the differentiation closet. But the idea with inquiry-based learning is that the kids set their own questions that they want to figure out. What do you want to learn about the universe today? Like what kind of project is that? Now, inquiry-based learning can be technically part of a lot of stuff. Like IB schools tend to be very focused on this. I would say that compared to gifted and talented education, IB schools go far, but they definitely don't go that open. Their projects are still very, very focused on a particular learning outcome. Whereas with inquiry-based learning, the outcome is set by the kids themselves, and it can be as wild as can be. And this is obviously really a lot of fun with gifted kids because you don't really know often how far these kids can go. So like independent inquiry-based learning is definitely where we go. Now, and the thing that for us in Passend holds things together is learning contracts. So the idea with learning contracts initially is about behavioral stuff. So in primary, when we do use them, they're a bit more around like, okay, like what kind of things do you want to work on, what things you want to commit to, and you name it. When we work with schools that are in secondary, we get more into what we called like pull-out programs, and the kids get more choice in where they get pulled out of. And then the idea with the learning contract is that they basically commit to the work needing to be done to either do pre-tests or catch up on a curriculum that they might not be sitting in terms of lectures, so that and then so on. But also a bit of a contract on like what stuff can be taken out. So actually, learning contracts sort of work for all these things again. The way that we work with them in help is based on a model that came from the Lyceum in Nijmegen originally, where we call them the revolving door pullouts, where the kids get to decide, okay, I want to be pulled out of math. They go and get a contract that they have to negotiate with the teacher that they're being pulled out of. Then the teacher gets to say, okay, I want to know where you are. You need to show this to me. If you have any learning gaps with the material coming up, the project has to be particularly about that. If there's anything that I need you to catch up with, then I need you to do that. And the students can say, yeah, but if I'm going to do that, I want to get a little bit less work here. I want you to compact stuff. I want you to stretch an accordion, some things here and there. And then I'm going to promise that I'm going to do my best on the project and making sure that it works. And that should normally create a situation where you get a child that really understands, oh, why am I doing all these things in terms of jumping through hoops for school? Because like when you ask them to say, okay, I'm going to be pulled out and I'm going to commit to this extra work, they learn a lot about how the school works. But also about like to understand, oh, this is not stimulating for me. This is too easy. I can move on. Let's do something else with this. And basically, what we're hoping to see is that at a certain point, they start doing these learning contracts on their own. They just walk up to the teacher and say, okay, like I love physics, but the topics that are coming up are too easy for me, or need something very specific for my extracurricular activity or my letter that I want to send to university that goes a little bit deeper. Can I do this instead? and I'll promise you that I do this and this. Now, if once kids get this, the world becomes their oyster. Like a very famous person that essentially did a version of this in at university level is Steve Jobs. He didn't graduate from his university, but he just went into each and individual subject that he felt was useful for him to start Apple. And he was very selective and very specific about it. And the failure in this particular situation from the university that he was in was that they basically didn't realize that they had somebody on hand that had the responsibility to finish things if he needed to. But they said, oh, no, you have to, this is our degree, this is what you need to learn. But of course, when he was studying, the concept of somebody building personal computers was still relatively new. There wasn't a study that would fit that mold. And for Steve Jobs, he just said, okay, I'll learn what I need to, and then I'll do it. So he actually did receive an honorary degree from the university he dropped out of, because like it doesn't look very good on your books. But it's one of those things that I think, particularly with kids that have very strong sense of justice and say like very strong opinions about how things go, learning contracts are amazing tools to really get them to do stuff. Right. So with all that, so I think we've had all of these now done. We've spoken about this, we've spoken about this. Like there's only one left. And the reason I left this one to last was because acceleration is one of those things that often is seen as the goal of gifted and talented education. That's definitely not right. That's not what gifted and talented education is about at all. But in some cases, it is the easiest way to help kids. Now, it does require a few things. It requires them to be really good at most of the time their core subjects. So, like we're talking, of course, about math and about English. Um, and if they can be good at all those things, if they're lucky to have had their interests at a young age guided towards those particular subjects, then often acceleration is a really, really good way of quickly giving them more challenge. But right, there is some negative side effects that are often looked at from a wrong lens. So I've had a girl that was 4 years old, and she was offered to go to year 3 in an IB school, and the mom was like, I think she's a bit too young, and kept her back. This particular girl then proceeded by herself to sign herself up for every ECA possible, to the point where the mom said, I'm getting worried. What is going on? Like, can she handle this pressure? To which I said, it's like if you would have put her in year 3, none of this would have probably happened, right? But my own professor, Lianne Hogeveen in the Netherlands, she wrote a particular article. And she's done this article multiple times. She always jokes about how there's almost like this wave back and like this ebb and flow of whether acceleration is good or bad. And the argument is always like, oh, how are they going to hold up socially, emotionally? Aren't they going to be like bullied or things like that? And she's done many longitudinal studies to that exact effect, like and not just in the Netherlands and a few other places. And her study has been replicated before as well. Currently published in the American Handbook of Giftedness, which is we consider a bit of the Bible. It's this big a book. It's a really interesting read. But she's debunked the idea that it's a bad thing to accelerate kids many times over. And every time he comes back, people say, yeah, we have to be mindful. But the impact of accelerating a kid that is capable of being accelerated versus their social potential distress, the social distress is almost always negligible, and it's much easier to correct for than the actual coursework. And I've helped accelerate a few kids with schools that were very difficult about this. And in every one of those cases that I've done it, the actual social interaction with these kids just went better, not worse. So acceleration, if possible, if the school allows it, can be a really, really important tool. But sometimes we need to convince people that this is the case. It might be good for those that are here to maybe put a few questions in the chats if you want to. about this particular topic already, because like I would love to go a little bit more detail on them if I need to. And then just find um, where the actual chat is. Um, there we go. Okay. So maybe Fatih, you can help me read out any questions that come out in a second. That'll be great. But yeah, so I will move on to the next topic, and if there's any questions there, I will come into that one as well. So how do we deal with this? So now we know what should happen in a classroom, according to decades of gifted and talented education. But how do we get the schools to do this? And that is kind of related to the actual question that was being asked today, which is um, like particularly for kids that have trouble starting tasks and then also completing them. In this case, I know the kid has a little bit of challenges with perfectionism. So in particular in this situation, the problem is that they've asked for accommodation, but it's been waved away as poor attitude, right? So how do we deal with this? So what I've done is I've taken what I normally give as it's like a 10-step plan when it comes to like asking the schools like how to do this. And the best way to look at this is that what we want is we want the right kind of effect with the least amount of effort from the school necessary, because any kind of extra work that we ask them to do is going to create more friction. And what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and help you understand a little bit like where that friction comes from with a teacher. That doesn't mean that you have to not do it. It means that it allows you to build a little bit of empathy on particularly what we can help these teachers with. Right. So the lowest thing that we can do, the first thing is share your observations. So if you come in and you say, you're not helping my child, you're not doing this, anything else, most people are going to get very defensive. If you come in and say, hey, I've observed these things in my child, and the idea with this is you want to be as specific as you can. This is what they said. This is what they struggled with. I'm noticing that when I'm doing the homework with my child, I'm seeing this. And basically giving the teachers more information. Let's still assume that the majority of the teachers want to listen to you quite a bit. So why this works as a low friction kind of thing is because it's really quick for teachers to normally do stuff with. It is actually a very positive experience normally. Say, oh, this is what they like. So if you can even make that a bit more of a positive focused kind of thing, like, oh, this one he really liked, this one worked really well. Like whenever that was happening, he was talking about it in the classroom, and he really was doing his work. It turns it from a negative conversation into a positive conversation, which normally gets a lot of teachers go like, oh, okay, cool, I'm going to do more with this. And that helps a lot, right? It doesn't take them a lot of time as well. Like it's very low effort on all of us. And what that means sometimes, though, is that you need to put yourself in a position to be able to do this. So do you walk up to the teachers? Do you see them? Don't just wait for PTM. So it requires a lot of proactivity from your end. So that's where we start in the first tier. If that doesn't work, asking questions, and you'll get a bit more time to do this during PTMs, is really important. Like here, it's about like a bit of if you tell teachers to do stuff, again, you get them to feel like very defensive. But if you ask questions like, oh, but how could we help them to get more interested? Right. So if he says, yeah, he doesn't seem very interested in the lesson, he's walking around to say, oh, well, what could we do together to make the lesson more interesting? And it reframes it as like the kid is problematic. So you're not looking at his behavior, you're looking at the situation. What can we do? What would keep him busy? When do you not see him walking around? Like, what is the difference there, right? How does he respond to positive reinforcement? And if there's like, oh, I've not actually done any positive reinforcement at all, then okay, then we know that that's where we're going. Now, the idea here is that the questions you ask help them reflect on their own bits. Like this is again a very stoic way of looking at stuff. The teacher saying your child is being naughty or not compliant or whatever it is basically saying this is outside of my control, therefore I'm throwing it to you. Whereas asking, well, what can we do to change how we interact with this child is about actions that you as a teacher, they as a teacher, or you as a parent can take, and reframing it as a way of saying, okay, well, what can I do to reinforce the same behavior? So what positive thing do you do in class that I could try doing the same way, so that like we can get his positive behaviors to happen more often, his negative behaviors to stop. Right? It's very fun if you get really good at framing a conversation like that. If that still doesn't have the impact, then it is fair to say, can we ask for some adjustments? And this is where it's very important that you have to understand first what the needs of your child are. So what kind of things are related to their giftedness, and what things are not, like understanding that the hypersensitivity and or the hypermotor overexcitabilities are part of their natural brain chemistry, and that there's some bits of it that they can't fully control. Where I say, okay, is it okay for him to have like a little pause routine, or is it okay for him to have like a little fidget toy that doesn't make a lot of noise, so that he can focus better on you? Or can we have like a little book he can doodle in, so he doesn't like write on his pad all the time? And the idea here is that like the small adjustment will have a bit of an impact on stuff, right? So um, like if you say, okay, well, I'm going to give him a book and he's going to draw in it, it might be that some other kids want to do the same thing. So you need to either sort of have a script ready for the teacher to be able to say, yeah, this is why that is necessary. Like if you don't know how to tell it to the other kids, here it is. You might need, so going like, oh, I just need somewhere else to draw, versus you bringing a book in to actually help with that is better. But I mean, where the a lot of friction comes, sometimes the teachers think, oh, I need to get more materials, or like I need to look at like whether they are actually not taking the mickey out of like an extra privilege that they get. So this is why you get a little bit more resistance from the teacher. Um, so the next one is that like you take these things in and then you focus on engagement. So this is really important. Whenever you get a value judgment of your child, turn it into a particular engagement problem. It is an engagement problem, generally speaking. Like there is obviously exceptions to that. So taking feedback on whether your child might be a little bit spoiled or not can also be quite good. But if you feel that you're really doing your best to not or have quite firm rules for that at home, then it shouldn't be an issue, right? So um, focus on the engagement bit. What is not working? What should we do? And why teachers are going to be frustrated with this is because it needs them often to observe things before they happen, which in some classes where there's 24 to 30 kids is a lot harder, and particularly because you need to look for patterns, right? So it's not just enough to observe them once. And this is the big issue with a lot of the feedback you're getting from teachers saying, oh, this doesn't work, because they sort of judge it on these at the end measurements of whether things have worked or not. Um, the next one is build a teacher partnership. So the idea being is that you really need to go out of your way to try and build a better bond with your teacher. For one, it's one way that you can see where the teacher's values are, and if they align with what your values are. And if they are, and they are teachers that have been around for a while, or they have the good kind of the professionalism in education, sometimes that allows you to sort of wait out the strategy. Like some kids do play the teacher out against the parents and vice versa. um, but the relationship building does take a lot of time. Like you need to spend more time after school, talk to them, listen to them. You need to have more open communications. A lot of times when I see this, when people start getting their WhatsApp notifications, not all teachers will want to give you those kind of things. And making that like you're going to eat a lot into their personal time, right? Particularly, that's why that bit is kind of hard. Um, Now, if that fails, like if most good teachers, if you can get anywhere close to this particular 5 steps, we're still looking at relatively low friction kind of stuff. I think these are things that should be a very natural, normal conversation for you to have with a teacher. But if that sort of breaks down, we go a little bit further. Now, formal meetings are obviously sometimes necessary, particularly if you can see that some of the physical or neurological constraints put on your child as a gifted kid that you know is really having a bad impact, then sometimes a formal meeting needs to happen. And this is, you have to come in well prepared if you go into a meeting like this. What is a gifted child? What is the definition? What does the school define a gifted child as? Like, what policy is there? If you could find all of that before, the better that is, so that you know what kind of rights you have. Like, 'cause sometimes, in particular, kids that are not doing well, because most of the time there's some kind of behavioral issue around like fighting or whatnot. Like most schools, like international schools, if they know a child is neurodivergent, have different policies when it comes to conflict resolution. But they will not always enact them because a lot of parents don't know what they can do. And so it's really good to understand what kind of options you have here. But of course, like teachers get more frustrated because now more people are necessarily aware. There's documentation involved. Normally, there's an action plan that comes out of it, which then puts a lot of strain on them too. And if that still doesn't work, you start involving other support structures. So this is where, if the schools have SEN departments or gifted and talented departments, what can they do? So in the schools that we work, for example, we get very often requests from parents to sit in on particular meetings like this. And honestly, if you can have a bit of a neutral party in there that could understand the neurological challenges that the gifted kids run into, then this helps you a lot. But of course, when this happens, things get even more formal. Generally speaking, with ITCC, there's often like extra, I wouldn't say benefits, but like they get more time, for example, at exams or like other kind of things, and that requires a lot of extra work administratively to help enact as well. Um, Now, interventions, not all schools have these available. Sometimes the school will ask for these, but what you can do is you can actually, within the time of the school itself, you can ask for interventions. And I always find it very interesting where some of the parents will go like, oh, like, but they'll be missing classes and so on. But like when it comes to pull out and interventions, which are much more effective if you do them during school time, you basically taking a little step back, like a little step back, to be able to jump over a much bigger gap. Like so when we need to jump over a gap that is a little bit harder for us to do, we also have to take step backs to take a running start. And we often don't give our kids this particular thing, but obviously if you're like, okay, I think this is important, sometimes the schools will go, yeah, but like they're going to miss this, they're going to miss that. But like if kids are on this trajectory of completely disengaging with school, like it's better to miss something now than it is to drop out of school completely. So like it's always about the general long-term strategy, what you're trying to get out of this. And I mean, to be honest, like in most schooling settings, the focus on getting A's in year 7 or 8, for example, is completely irrelevant because, like, ideally, you still have a year 10 or 11 when they actually start to IGCSE exams. That's when the grades really matter, right? So if you can take a little bit of a reset or a pause for them to basically introduce what is a force multiplier for gifted kids, the intervention is actually a good thing. But of course, is there one available in the school as an actual policy? Very important. And then when all this happens, most of the time interventions require significant changes in the curriculum material. So a lot of schools struggle with this. To be fair, though, like the schools that we're working with, because we have this option of doing them as peer classes or even as extension kind of like classes for the kids when we need to. Like what I really like with the schools that we're working with, that we have quite a big group of students. Some of the students just walk into our differentiated learning office as and when they want to, just to talk and offload some challenges from them and say, like I've had a terrible exam. Can I sit here for a few minutes? Like creating a bit of a safe space. And I think when you look at like an intervention, that's what it's supposed to do. Now, the last two are basically about being very clear about the educational need. So what is the thing that we're trying to achieve? Reframe it back. What is the goal? What is the end thing that we want to see? Most of the challenges that we saw in the very first slide are things that are just challenges for now. What you really want to achieve is self-sufficient, successful adults at some point in their life, right? And everything in between is just an opportunity to really learn what they can. If you have a very clear goal of where we want to go, then it's more easy to sort of get what you want out of that whole situation. But again, sometimes schools don't like to look at kids in that much detail, or they just don't have the capacity to do so, which is why that gets hard. And also, um, yeah, like when you bring things back to overall goals and say normally frustration happens with schools at this point because they go, okay, yes, we know we have on our tagline all this stuff, but actually we want to do some of these other things. So there we go. Um, the last thing here is basically about escalation. Like again, what kind of regulations do you have? And this is then the final litmus test. Like, is the SLT team on board, right? So how far can you take this? And I want to say something about this, which is really important. And I'm a foreigner in Malaysia in particular, so I can't advocate for civil disobedience as such. But I do think that one of your duties as a parent of a potentially gifted kid is to start advocating for it more firmly. And the way that you can do this in a school settings is to get on school boards. Because if you want to have real impact on the SLTs, then being like part of the solution is really, really important. So can you get on a school board? You'd be surprised how few people that um, truly care about stuff are on there sometimes. This is really true for some of our public schools in Malaysia. But you can have a lot of impact because like you'll be able to speak to the actual people in charge. And then sometimes like if there is no policy in place, you can do something here. Right. So I think that leaves quite a few things and things that you can do. Um, if you want to know a little bit more about the different differentiation techniques, please drop more questions in our weekly Q&A session, and I'll gladly wave them in there. As I said, this is just elements of communication that things aren't going well, not a value judgment of your kids. But I think with all this, we've got quite a lot of things to think about for tonight. And I want to end with one final thing for those that are in help school with us. As part of our normal programs, we're doing the positive discipline courses for parents. We are running one of those courses on Thursday morning at Help. So for the parents that are from Help that haven't signed up for that course yet, I would highly recommend to come in because Miss Fatia, who is also in the chat here, has been preparing her lesson the whole week for you guys, and she's looking really forward to share what she's learned in her um, positive discipline courses for parents. So for those that want to, you're more than welcome to come see us on Thursday. And for the other parents, the other schools, we'll be coming to do that course in your school very, very soon. So watch our announcements. Of course, if you want to see this back on YouTube, it will be online tomorrow. And I want to thank you all for your time listening to me tonight. And I wish you all a very, very good evening.